Welcome back to part 2 of these corset making endeavors, in which I am attempting to reconstruct a Victorian corset from a surviving corset pattern drafted circa 1894 by the Symington Corset Company in Leicestershire, England. If you missed part 1, in which I experimented with how to get that right silhouette through a series of drafts, mock-ups, alterations, fittings, and pain, a lengthy process to try and achieve that classic 1890s shape on my asymmetrical upper body, then I shall put a link to that here. This video, however, will focus less on the drafting and asymmetry aspects of this project and more on the actual construction techniques involved in late 19th century corsetry. That is right! I actually have to use a sewing machine for this project. The main fabric I've chosen for the outer body of the corset is this sort of creamy pale golden silk satin. Whilst laying out my pieces, I came to the realization that I really wanted to try and pin the satin as little as possible, since the surface is quite delicate and will show lots of little pinholes if I'm not careful. So I decided to use pattern weights to stabilize the paper whilst tracing around. But since I don't actually own pattern weights, I just used some £1 coins instead. They're remarkably effective. Then I'm tracing around the pieces with a bit of white tailor's chalk. Yes, I'm doing this on the right side of the silk, which seems a bit scary, but then again, the whole seaming process for external boned corsets is all a bit unnatural, as you shall discover presently. As I explained briefly in part 1, I'm laying out the rest of my pieces according to the original pattern diagram. That is, placing the center front and center back edges on the straight grain, but allowing the side panels to sit in the slightly off-grain position in which they are depicted on the draft. These slight deviations help to place the panels at strategic points so that the grain works with the curves of the body and eliminates some of the pulls and wrinkles that would occur if all the pieces were placed on the straight grain. I should also note that I've taken the extra step of tracing out each piece individually, not doubled up on the fabric. This way I can assure that all of my pieces are properly placed on the grain, as sometimes the piece cut on the underlayer ends up slightly warped or off grain where you couldn't see it when tracing. Usually this isn't such a noticeable problem with heavier and more sturdy fabrics such as one-to-one woven cotton, but with such a fine silk, I was really rather inspired to take the time to do things as neatly and carefully as possible. I'm then tracing out all of the boning channels at 3/4 of an inch wide, with 1/2 inch of seam allowance on either side to fold under for strengthening. This corset has 2 bones per channel, so each strip will hold 2/4 inch bones. Everything else is cut out with roughly 1/2 inch of seam allowance. But we're not finished cutting yet. For the lining layer, I've decided to use some of the white cotton sateen left over from the Regency portrait gown I did a couple of months back. Contrary to modern belief, 19th century corsets didn't necessarily have to be the strong, unyielding fortresses that a lot of fashion and couture corsets are today. For comfort, necessary ease of movement, or lighter weight in summer months, lighter corsets made from just 1 or 2 layers of light cottons or silks instead of rigid coutils and heavy interfacings were quite common. Cotton sateen is a really great lighter weight option that is still tightly woven enough to give some extra body to the silk, which I think is going to be particularly helpful in trying not to shift my back too much as a heavier coutil might. Now that I have all of my pieces cut out, I began hearing the faint whispers of every teacher and mentor I've ever had in the back of my head, softly urging me to be a proper little seamstress and thread mark over my chalk lines. So that is precisely what I began to do. Not only will this help me to see the faint white lines a bit better, especially when the chalk starts to rub off, but it will also allow me to follow my seam lines through both sides of the fabric, which will be important. I'm only doing this to the satin layer though, since when I stitch the panels together, the satin will technically be treated as the wrong side and I won't need to see the seam lines on the cotton. You'll see. Now that those panels are thread marked, I can start flatlining the panels. This is done by pinning the satin and cotton layers together with right sides outwards, contrary to modern lining methods in which the lining layer and the fabric layer would be stitched up separately, sewn together at the edges, and then turned out. Historical garments were lined like so, with the fabric and lining layers attached and then treated as a single layer when the garment was stitched together. It doesn't conceal the raw edges, but it does give the outer fabric a much nicer body, since both layers are firmly attached and can behave as a single hybrid fabric. In order to prevent these fabrics from sliding around and misbehaving whilst stitching, I'm first pad stitching them together. This is effectively just a long basting stitch that runs the length of the entire panel so that both layers are held firmly into place. Midway through the basting, I realized that the center front and center back panels actually do not get flatlined, since the center front and center back edges will indeed have to be stitched right sides together and then turned so that those outer edges are finished. But before I can stitch the center front edges together, I must first account for the loop side of the busk, which is going to poke through this seam. So I'm just now taking this side of the busk and marking out where the loops will need to be. When stitching, I'll skip over these marks so that the loops will have a space to slot through. Now, because historical reconstruction is my absolute jam, that is, attempting to recreate historical things as they may have been done originally, I'm really excited to get to put my 1891 Singer machine to use on this 1890s project. She isn't quite as advanced as the foot-powered treadle machine, but since this is obviously before the age of electric machines, she's powered by hand, which is a bit of an adjustment when you're used to having both hands free to control the fabric under today's electric sewing machine. But as I do most of my work slowly and by hand anyway, I'm really rather taken with this method. With the machine all ready to go, I'm starting off just by stitching those center back seams along my seam line so that I can turn the lining over. Then I'm stitching the two center front edges, but making sure to skip over those marked points for the busk loops on the right hand side. The seams are then pressed open, then flat, so that my edges are nice and crisply finished. I'm now just marking the lines for the bones that sit just at the edge of the center back. These are thin bones that I'll insert into a channel between the satin and lining layers, and will strengthen that outer edge against the pull of the lacing on the eyelets. Then I can insert the busk, and I'm just basting all around that edge to set it in snugly before I stitch it. In retrospect, I sort of wish I'd just backstitched the entire busk in by hand instead of trying to do it by machine, since the one and only foot that survived with my machine does not function like the modern day zipper foot that would make this task worlds easier and neater. The knobbly side of the busk is inserted like so, pinning the top and bottom into position so that it matches up to the loop side, then poking the holes with an awl at the necessary points. It should be noted that, just like eyelet holes, I'm not actually breaking the fabric, just separating the weave of the material for the knobs to slide through. But before I head to the machine, I'm just taking a second to mark the couple of cording lines on the hip panels. Cording was a very common strengthening technique, most popular in the earlier 19th century, in which entire corsets could be constructed only with cording and no boning at all. By the later 19th century, however, cording is frequently used in conjunction with boning to give softer structure at strategic points on a corset. This could involve anything from a few rows of cording at the hip panels, like the pattern I'm working from calls for, to entire panels being corded. Once again, since I don't have a zipper foot, or whatever the late 19th century equivalent, as zippers obviously weren't a thing yet, a cording foot perhaps, I'm just stitching the cording channels flat and will thread the cords through later. But whilst I'm here at the machine, I'm going to first go ahead and take care of those other stitching tasks, namely stitching down that center back boning channel, and then stitching in the busks. Along with the basic function of keeping everything securely in place, the basting line also provides a safe stitching path so that I can get close to the busk without hitting it. Yes, it was a nightmare to surgically remove these basting stitches later, but it happened. Again, I very much regret not just hand stitching the busk into place to begin with, as was apparently the custom when one didn't have the appropriate foot. History usually knows best with these things. So now to put in the cording. The channels on the pattern, and subsequently on my pieces, are roughly 1/8 of an inch, so I'm using a sensible 1/8 inch linen stay cord here. This I'm just threading through a large blunt-tipped tapestry needle, then threading this through my channels. It's a bit tight, since the cording does indeed have to be tight in the channels, and did require the use of some pliers. I have no evidence to support the historical accuracy of this method, but it worked. So now that all of our pieces are prepped with their respective fancy bits, I can actually start putting the corset together. I'm just starting with my 3 side panels here, pinning them wrong sides together so that the seam allowances face to the outside of the corset. Since this corset has boning channels on the exterior, some of the channels will be placed strategically over the seams to cover the raw edges, and this way I won't have to worry about finishing any edges on the inside. With those panels stitched together, I'm now trimming down the seam allowances to a bit less than 1/4 of an inch, then pressing them open. And for once, I am using my tailor's ham for its intended purpose. That is, pressing 3-dimensional shapes into curved seams, instead of using it as that lap cushion for pinning my hand sewing to. It works quite well for this, fancy that. So now that I have all these panels connected, I can go ahead and add the hip panel, which is going to be stitched on more conventionally with the seam allowances facing inward, since there won't be a horizontal bone going across this seam, and the waist tape on the inside of the corset should cover this raw seam. Finally, I can finish assembly by attaching the front and back panels. Once again, we're back to pinning to the outside again, since we'll have bones over these seams. All of my seam allowances here, by the way, are trimmed down to 1/4 of an inch, then pressed open so that they'll sit snug and flat underneath my boning channels. And now that the panels are secured together, I can go ahead and remove the pad stitching. Now I'm just prepping all of my boning channels by pressing under the 2 seam allowance edges. The seam allowances are left quite wide, almost reaching to the opposite end. That way they'll act as sort of 2 additional strength layers. And because I'm being super pedantic about this, I'm just pressing my finished channels in a heavy book while they cool off. Honestly though, it really did make the creases much crisper, so judge all you want, but it worked. My newly pressed and beautifully crisp channels are then lightly pinned into place on the corset layer. Then the channels are basted into place. I'm using a fairly wide basting stitch here, hoping to secure them just enough whilst poking as few holes as possible into the satin. It's also important to note that during this basting and the previous pinning step, you'll see me working according to the shape of the corset. That is, rather than attaching the channels flat, I'm trying to mold them into position with my hands whilst I stitch. This ensures that the channels ease over the curves properly instead of fighting them and will hopefully prevent some wrinkling. So all of my boning channels are now basted in, ready to be stitched down, and the thought has occurred to me that I have not even thought to address this whole issue of the waist tape. This only just sort of surfaced in my mind because I'm reading this book called The Dress Detective by Ingrid Maida and Alexandra Kim, which I guess I'll link somewhere. But basically, this is kind of irrelevant. It's a book about examining extant garments, and one of their case studies is an 1890s corset. And I noticed on the inside of their extant garment, they've got a waist tape in it. The stitching for the boning channel lines are running over the waist tape, so the waist tape is stitched down to the actual corset. For some reason, I guess I had it in my head that the waist tape goes in at the end. That's not true. And I feel like now that I've seen that extant example, I now feel like I've read somewhere on foundations or heard like 100 times that the waist tape does not go in last. Thankfully, I have caught this just in time. Well, not just in time, really. I have caught this not terribly too late, because of course when I realized that I would need to put in a waist tape, I realized I didn't know how to do that. Michelle Fitzgerald, whose corsetry work is the literal work of the gods, I shall link her Instagram below somewhere. She's written a ton of articles, looked at how she did the waist tape, and of course, looked at some extant corsets. They've all got waist tapes that are anchored in this, between this center front seam as well as between this center back seam. So something that I probably should have thought about and done before I stitched it all together, which makes me sort of think that the busk does not go in first. I'm questioning a lot of my techniques here, but whoever said I was producing a tutorial, not me. Don't follow this at home. So I have my waist tape. I bought a waist tape because I knew I would have to put one in. It's just a little bit of 1-inch twill tape. So this is what I've bought. This is just going to hypothetically, theoretically, sit just here. It curves a little bit because the waist is curved, as we have learned, and ideally cover up this raw seam here. I don't think I'm going to be unpicking these seams just because I feel like that's going to weaken them, also because I just can't be bothered. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to pin this into place. I'm going to leave it loose a little bit on either end, and then what I will do is once this is all stitched down, once all of the boning channels are in and running over this waist tape properly, I will just go back in and turn this under, match it up nicely, I hope, fell it down, and hopefully that will keep it in place. The purpose of the waist tape is to just give it a little anchor point at the waist to give it a little bit of strength. Thankfully, I guess since this corset technically isn't going to be functional, the waist tape won't necessarily have to be super strong and super functional because there won't actually be pressure on my waist, I hope, otherwise we have problems. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pinned in so that I can go ahead and get started on stitching down these boning channels. So it turns out the natural waist point on this corset is not where that hip panel ends. The waist point becomes pretty apparent. It's that sort of groove path in the natural shaping of the corset that the upper and lower areas want to curve out of, if that makes any sense. I'll put arrows or something. That little diversion aside, I then began the long and arduous journey of stitching on all those boning channels. Okay, so it is the next morning. I haven't quite gotten all of these boning channels stitched down on this side yet. However, the realization has come upon me that as it is Friday, we are coming up on the weekend, and there are a few things that I still need to purchase for this project that I will probably need to get to this weekend and that I probably won't be able to obtain since most of the shops in the garment district will be shut. I thought it would be prudent today to take a little adventure and obtain the last couple of little essentials that we need to finish up this corset. So what I'm still looking for, I don't have any any lacing for this, so I need to find some sort of woven cotton braiding or something for the lacing for this. I have realized that the trash synthetic lacing that I was using on the mock-up will not work for this at all. The second thing I need is I need some heavy silk buttonhole twist thread to do the flossing for the bones. Because I seem to be on a theme here of matching undergarments subtly with little touches of red, what I really wanted to do is find a sort of a deep red silk buttonhole twist that will match the satin ribbon that's the accent on the combinations. And then I also, this isn't necessary, but a lot of 1890s, well, 19th century corsets in general have sort of a wide or even narrow strip of lace at the top edge and sometimes at the bottom as well. So I thought it might be fun to look for something like that. I'm not sure if we're going to have any luck finding something similar, only because the beautiful Victorian laces that existed on extant garments, will still exist on extant garments, just aren't made anymore. But I thought maybe I will have a look for something. If there's something good in the garment district, I will definitely pick that up. I'm thinking probably I'm not going to have very much luck with the regular affordable trimming shops. This feels like something that I would find in East Coast Trimming or Mukuba. We're gonna have a look. We'll see if there's something really beautiful. I really only need probably about a yard of it, not even. $15 a yard for a bit of lace is a lot when you need 12 yards of it, but $15 for a yard of lace maybe isn't so bad when you just need 1 yard of it. We'll see what we come up with, if there's something good and not too terribly expensive. So yeah, I'm going to take this lovely lady with me because the other one's still half under the machine. It's also snowing outside, so we will have to wrap her in some very historically inaccurate plastic. I'm so sure we can find a place for millinery flowers on Lady Sherlock. No? These are so beautiful. Oh, look at them. I decided that I actually quite liked this lace, but also that this lace would be even better with a bit of deep red satin ribbon. Okay, I got the lace. I also got a bit of lacing while I was there. They had a bit of cheap, just cotton woven lacing. The lace was only $4.75 a yard, so it wasn't immensely expensive as I thought it might be. And then I bought the tiny roses. Treat yourself. So this isn't on my list, but I'm now actually headed to M&J just to see if they have any, what's this, 1/4 inch wide deep red silk ribbon, because I'm trash. It is back to work now. Whilst the snow does things outside, I resume stitching down these boning channels, and every time I mentally gripe about how long it's taking, roughly I think about 4 or 5 hours to stitch everything down, I just remind myself that one day I'm going to be making some stays by hand, and that in fact I'll be reminiscing very fondly upon this moment on the 4th straight day of backstitching boning channels. And once both sides of the boning channels are stitched down, I can go ahead and remove my basting thread so that I can stitch down the middle to create 2 separate channels. Okay, so my boning channels are all stitched down. I just wanted to take a moment to point out that just take a second and look at the amount of shape that this has already. This has got no bones in it. It's got absolutely no whalebone, no steel. It's just a soft corset, but already it's wanting to hold such a dramatic shape. And I think this is part of the magic of Victorian corsetry, in that we just assume that the Victorians had these tiny waists and these deformed bodies by wearing these corsets that were just full of all these strong steel rods that were bending their bodies into shapes. That's just not true. The majority of the shaping on Victorian corsets comes from the shaping of the pattern pieces, comes from these little tiny magical details like the waist tape, like the positioning of the boning channels, like this bit of cording here. All these very soft elements work together to create these really subtle, graceful, elegant, dramatic shapes that are actually quite comfortable. So I'm very excited to go ahead and start getting the bones into this. I'm hoping that once the bones are in, all of these, or at least most of these small wrinkles will start to go away, and especially once I get the flossing, it can put some tension on this. I'm going to be using synthetic baleen for this. Some Victorian corsets were done with steel, spiral, or flat steel boning. I'm going to be using baleen just because it's lighter, it's going to be easier on my back. Baleen was still very much used in the late Victorian period, although it was starting to get a bit more difficult to come by, but we have synthetic baleen nowadays, so that's what I'm going to be using. The great thing about synthetic baleen, and of course baleen historically, is that it's very light, it's very flexible, and it molds to the shape of your body with heat or steam. So if you are wearing your corset, especially in hotter temperatures, your corset will start to literally form the shape of your body specifically. This process can be facilitated a bit by going in and once you have your corset, just gently shaping it with an iron and a bit of steam. This process got so advanced in the Victorian period that they actually started to, especially, I'm not sure if this probably was regular within corset manufacturing, but the Symington collection specifically have records and of course actual evidence of their steaming process, and that they would actually have like mannequin-like dress form type forms that they laced the corsets onto, and they were metal and they were full of holes, and they just blow steam through the inside of them so that the corsets would already have this incredible shape before the wearer even put it on, which is really cool. I, however, do not have one of those magical steam form things, so I will have to be doing this with my very disappointingly modern 21st century iron. The catch is, since I have most wisely decided to make this corset out of silk satin, I cannot use steam on this because the steam will just destroy the silk satin. So I cannot put the bones into here first. How they would get around this historically is that their silk corsets would obviously be lined with cotton or something, so when you lace this onto a form and the steam came through it, most of the moisture would just be hitting the cotton layer. So I suppose technically, I mean, I guess theoretically maybe I could do the steaming work from the back. Maybe we'll give that a try if my current cutting plan doesn't work, but my current cutting plan, I've still got all of my bones in my final mock-up. I have obviously harvested the busk out of it so it can't actually close. I had really intended to put this on my dress form for a week and just leave it and let it absorb some sort of shape from an actual body, but then I remembered I cut the busk out and I can't exactly do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to steam the bones into shape on this corset, and then hopefully the bones will have some sort of vague shaping already in them, enough so that when I put them into this, they won't want to just sit very straight and annoyingly curved like they are in this one, and will actually embrace this beautiful shape that we have going on here. So that's what I'm going to be up to right now. I think let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so look, we have a corset. It's happening slowly. You can see some shaping starting to happen. I think now, I'm actually not sure precisely what order we're supposed to do the binding versus flossing versus finishing everything else, lacing, grommeting. I have mapped out on my very elaborate schedule for this, do the flossing today, so I guess I will do that today. I'm not entirely sure what exactly I'm going to do for it. Basically, okay, hold on, I should explain what flossing is in case you don't know. Essentially a little embroidery stitch that goes at the bottom of the bones, just to, well, the bottom and the tops of the bones, just to hold them securely into place so they can't move up and down and they can't try and poke through the binding. This is very prevalent, if not almost ubiquitous, on 19th century corsetry, and it actually got so elaborate that you can very often see flossing that's done in the shape of flowers or feathers, multiple colors. A lot of them actually puncture through the bones because they had machinery that could do that. I sadly don't have machinery that can do that, so my flossing probably will not quite be that elaborate, but I'm going to try and do something a little bit decorative. It could also be, you know, entirely functional of just, you know, a couple of stitches going across this. I think I want to do something a little bit more decorative because whoever wanted to do anything the easy way, am I right? So hence why I went to the garment district to buy this lovely deep ruby red silk thread. I've been looking at a lot of flossing designs online. However, I think rather than replicating something, I'm going to try and make something up myself, only because a lot of them do involve puncturing through the bones, which I can't do because these are plastic. They're not actual baleen, they're not cane, they're not reed, and they're not steel that come with holes punctured through the ends of them. What I think I will do is I may just adapt some of those designs or take elements from those designs and try and work them, treating these double bones as a single bone. So sort of trying to floss both of this and then being able to puncture through the middle down here where there's actually no bone. And I may do a sample and I may hate that. So yes, let's do some samples and see what we can come up with. Okay, so rather than experiment by actually stitching various samples on my actual corset, which I decided probably wasn't a good idea, I decided to just draw out the boning channels on some paper and play around with some lines. So this is what I've come up with, fairly simple, but I love these designs that sort of look like plants or flowers. That's sort of what I've gone for. This is for the double bones, and then this is for the two at the center back that are just single bones. It's heavily inspired by this pattern here that's on one of the Symington corsets. Not exact, but it was a nice little reference inspiration. So I think we're going to go ahead and see if we can make this work on my corset. Okay, here is what I have for my single bone flossing so far. I'm quite happy with it, quite pleased with how it came out. However, I am not entirely convinced now that I'm not making a huge mistake in trying to do the flossing before I put on the binding. I'm not sure. What I like about doing it this way is that I can do a little waist knot sort of down here when I start off the embroidery stitch, just so that when I do put the binding on, this will be covered and it will just sort of look like that, which will be nice. However, there's also the chance that I will put the binding on and finish off these edges and find out that all of my positioning for the flossing is just completely wonky in comparison to where the actual edge of the corset is. I'm not entirely sure about how to proceed. I have gone ahead and I've cut a couple of strips of just 1/2 inch binding. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be too narrow. I'm having second thoughts about this. Okay, so here's the thing, is that historically binding on stays and on corsets and on bodies is cut on the straight grain. You'd think that's a little bit counterintuitive, because why not cut it on the bias so that it can stretch around the curves? You don't really do that because that's very consuming of fabric, and historically fabric was expensive and you don't really want to cut all the way diagonally through your fabric just for a couple of little strips of binding. There is a way to do it on the straight grain, and it's actually not so hard as you might think. The trick to getting nice, neat looking binding with a straight grain strip on a curved edge is to make the binding edge as narrow as possible. I cut them at 1/2 inch. I'm not sure if this is going to be too narrow. Theoretically, it would just stitch on here with a very tiny seam allowance. Wait, let's actually flip over this way and then around to the other side. I need to do this with 2 hands, so hold on 1 second. Yeah, I think this is going to be slightly too narrow, because by the time that we flip this round to the other side, there's not going to be very much to then tuck under and fell down on the other side. I've cut these too narrow. I'm gonna go cut some more binding strips. I'm first just trimming up the edges, then pinning on the binding with right sides together. This is done on both the top and bottom edges. This side gets stitched down by machine. The edges are trimmed down once again, this time to about 1/4 inch. Then the binding is folded in half, then folded again to cover the raw edge. This is secured into place with tiny Victorian-style whip stitches. And now that I've got the binding on, I think I'm going to go ahead and attach the top edging lace. I'm first just measuring out exactly the lengths I'll need so that I can go ahead and replace this boring synthetic ribbon with my beautiful new burgundy silk one. I've done this by threading it through a large tapestry needle and using the current ribbon as a guide to make things a bit easier. Okay, the lace is just pinned on for now. I'm going to stitch down in just a minute. But just after I stitch down the lace, I think I'm going to go right ahead and start on the flossing. Actually, I may stitch the bows down too. Anyway, I've got lots of little hand stitching work to do, obviously, because that's what finishing is. But I think right from the top edge of the lace, I'm going to start working on the flossing. And I haven't yet decided, this is why I'm on the vlog mode instead of the voiceover mode, but I just want to let it be known that I have not decided what exactly I'm going to do for the flossing. Yes, I do have my pattern all figured out, but on extant corsets you see definitely flossing on the bottom here, but on the extant corsets that you see that have this top edging lace, either one of two things. They don't have flossing at the top because stitching this down just at the top here will actually function in keeping the bones from poking out, so the flossing isn't necessary. On some occasions you do see flossing either just decoratively, sort of starting here and coming down, so I'm not sure if I'm going to try that. It may, I think, end up being too much just with the red here and then the amount of flossing that's going to be going on down here. We shall see. I think what I'm going going to go ahead and do is I'm going to stitch this down. I'm going to put the flossing on the bottom edge of the corset, and then I will probably put this on a dress form, maybe try it on, we'll see, and just take a long look at it and see if it could use some more flossing or if it's going to just be too much going on. I have a feeling that there is just no such thing as too much lace and too much flossing and too much embroidery detail on Victorian clothing. We shall see. Stay tuned. The lace is secured into place with a sort of whip stitch, diagonal running stitch. I have no historical evidence to support this decision, but for some reason decided it was practical. I'm then finishing off the ends of the waist tapes real quick by folding them under and felling them into place. Then begins the flossing. I'm pretty sure this is technically the first time I've embroidered anything, which is a bit embarrassing to admit considering it's been something on my list of techniques to experiment with for a lot of years. But herein lies the beauty of admitting such things to the internet, for now I get to dwell in the omnipresent knowledge that all you faraway friends will hold me accountable for future embroidery endeavors. So now I can't not embroider things, or so I shall believe. But anyway, moving on. The flossing is complete. It's not quite as elaborate and decorative as I might have hoped it would have been, but you know what? It's fine. It looks nice from a distance, maybe. I was still trying to decide if I should continue doing the flossing up at the top here. A lot of the reasons that I came up with not to do it, I think, are primarily motivated by laziness, which I don't think is good. Maybe we should give it a try. I don't think it's going to make it too busy. In fact, it might make it look cool. So, yes, I'll get over myself and I'll give it a go. What I may do, though, is I may only just do this top motif bit, not do this, as if it's sort of coming out from under this, except because the bottom bit will be concealed, I won't bother with this bottom detail here. I think that's the plan for now, and I shall go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so I have finished all of the flossing. It looks so nice. I'm really glad I did it. And I was about to get started on putting this little waist tape in here. Not waist tape, just a bit of tape to conceal these raw edges. And now I'm kind of not sure that this is a good idea, only because in theory the waist tape is put in here because it gives structure to this point in the corset, and I feel like part of me is a little bit worried that putting a bit of sturdy tape right here is going to do funny things that probably shouldn't happen. I'm now sort of inclined to just leave this raw, and the reason I am leaning towards this is because I've actually come to the realization that I have been handling this corset a lot whilst doing the flossing and everything, and the edges are not fraying terribly. It's all stitched down here, so I don't think it's at all unstable. Obviously, it's not ideal to have a raw edge on a tight-fitting garment sitting right next to the skin. I mean, also in theory, I guess this won't be terribly tight, or as tight as a corset should be. In any case, this whole nonsensical rant is me just ranting nonsensically. But okay, so here's the thing that I have discovered is that I have a feeling that this hip panel is actually supposed to come up to the waist, and it's supposed to be here. I just didn't do that. I didn't get the proportion right, and apparently did not notice this on any of the like 4 or 5 or whatever 6 mock-ups that I did. I feel like for the original pattern, the woman's waist would be here, and it would in fact be covered by the waist tape. There wouldn't be any extra structural issues of putting another seam finishing binding thing here, and all would have been well. So this is my mistake, not a historical accuracy, but I think I'm just going to leave it because this might not do good things. And now I think it is time to tackle the part that I have been putting off for so long, and that is the eyelets. If you know me and you know my method, you know that I habitually do everything by hand, including eyelets. I adore hand-done eyelets. However, I have sort of maybe mistakenly challenged myself to put in metal eyelets into this thing because those were very common in the late 19th century and in the 19th century in general. Yes, hand-worked eyelets did exist, however, metal eyelets were sort of a new innovation in that because the whole is finished with metal, the corset and lacing was stronger, you could pull it tighter. Not that I'm tight lacing this, but I feel like it's sort of an important historical feature of 19th century corsetry, especially late 19th century corsetry, and you know what? It's always good to challenge yourself to do new stuff. Right? I don't know. I've been dreading it though. I do have some metal grommets and a grommet setter from ye old days of Ren Fair bodice making. I'm not sure precisely how historical all of this is. Part of me is a little bit dubious as to the size of these, and I don't know, maybe the finish. I really don't know very much about eyelets, but I feel like a lot of the eyelets that I'm seeing on some of the extant corsets are smaller, maybe a little bit. I'll put one on here so that you can maybe get some scale. Well, they're not terribly huge, but yeah, I for some reason have it in my head that the ones on the extant corsets are a bit smaller. I may just use these because, I don't know, at this point I don't think I can be bothered to go out and buy new ones because, I mean, to be quite honest, if I have to buy a package of them, will I use them? No, probably not. I have these, I own these, kind of want to use these. Maybe this is just KonMari things getting to my head, but use what you have, right? Whether or not it's historically accurate. What is historical accuracy? Oh, now I'm having an existential crisis. Okay, let's set some grommets. Starting from 1 inch down from the top edge, I'm then marking the eyelets at 1 inch apart and marking 12 in total. I fell into a small hole of counting eyelets on photographs of extant corsets a while ago and found them to feature any number of eyelet holes, even and odd somehow, but most ranged from around 11 to 14 pairs. Now, usually it is my practice to never ever cut the weave of the fabric when putting in eyelet holes, because, especially in hand-worked ones, the fabric is significantly weaker and prone to just tearing eventually. However, I couldn't get the weave to separate widely enough to fit the metal grommets here, so I ended up doing that most blasphemous thing of clipping the fabric. I don't think it's such a big deal with the metal since it's supposed to be stronger, but nevertheless, it did kill my soul a little bit. Then I do the thing where I smash the grommets together, a task which is really great if you have a lot of inner rage. I don't really have a lot of inner rage though, just a lot of inner distaste for metal eyelets and incompetence with heavy tools, so I'm pretty much just silently screaming through all of this. Right, so grommets are finished. I kind of do hate them. I think they are a bit too big, a bit too present on this garment, which I don't feel like the historical eyelets are. Maybe I'm also just biased against metal eyelets, but yeah, this is where I am right now. I'm going to go ahead and put some lacing in her, and then we can go ahead and have a fitting. I'm not quite finished because I still do need to figure out the padding situation, but of course that's something that has to happen whilst I have the corset on so that I know where all the padding goes. So yes, we should go and do that now. Fancy learning how to lace a corset? For the lacing, I had purchased, I think, 6 yards of this cotton braid stuff, which upon reflection feels entirely too heavy and I will probably replace it. I'm going to lace this corset with 2 parallel loops just at the waist area, which was a very common method for lacing by the 19th century, since it made tightening and adjusting the corset much easier to do by yourself whilst wearing it. Yay for the small victories in female independence, am I right? Also, it would be really nice if this knot sat on the inside of the lacing, so if you're following along to learn how to lace a corset, thread your lacing through exactly opposite to how I've done it here. Now it's time to experiment with some padding. I'm using several layers of cotton batting for this, cutting it roughly into shape and stuffing it wherever it needs to go. I'll clean it up and stagger the thicknesses properly once I take it off, but for now I'm just trying to get a sense of where and how much stuffing to add. I have also made the most glorious discovery that placing thick pads in the middle of my back at either side actually did wonders in supporting my back and relieving some of the sway back discomfort. I'm not sure if this is a universal solution to this problem, but something to experiment with in future. After padding both sides, I then removed the corset to round off the edges of the pads and neaten them up a bit. Then I'm just pad stitching the layers together to secure them, gently working them into 3-dimensional shape as I do so. I'm then just lightly attaching the pads into position with a couple of tacking stitches. I was going to refinish the inside nicely by covering up all of the padding with patches of cotton sateen, but then decided that it would probably be best to keep the pads easily alterable if I decide anything is pressing too much, or if it just compresses down and I need to add more at any point. It's not the prettiest thing to look at on the inside, but a lady is allowed to keep a few cunning secrets, I think. And with that, she is complete-ish, I think, for now. I'll probably be messing around with the shaping and padding for the indefinable future, especially once I start to build the outer layers and incorporate additional padding into those as well. I also may or may not be debating ripping out and replacing the 2 back panels so that I can put in some more respectable grommets, or just give in